You're standing at the thermostat, arguing with a family member about whether 68 degrees is freezing or perfectly reasonable. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you already know how ridiculous this argument would sound to literally anyone who lived before central heating existed. Because here's the thing, your ancestors didn't have a thermostat. They didn't have insulated walls, double pane glass, or a furnace quietly humming in the basement. Some of them survived entire Ice Age winters in shelters you'd consider unlivable for a single overnight camping trip. So how exactly did ancient humans make it through months of brutal, sustained cold with nothing but fire, fur, and sheer stubbornness? The answer involves your own body doing something far stranger than you'd expect, and it starts before a single fire is even lit. Let's start with biology. Because the human body itself came preloaded with cold survival tools long before culture and technology entered the picture. Humans, like many mammals, possess a specialized tissue called brown adipose tissue, or brown fat, which functions completely differently from the fat most people think about when they hear the word. Rather than simply storing energy, brown fat is metabolically active tissue specifically built to generate heat directly, a process researchers call non-shivering thermogenesis. Studies using modern imaging techniques have confirmed that adult humans retain measurable deposits of this tissue, particularly around the neck and upper back, and that exposure to cold conditions can measurably activate it, essentially turning a portion of your own body into a built-in space heater running quietly in the background. This wasn't something ancient humans consciously understood or controlled. It was simply already running in the background of every ancestor who ever faced a brutal winter, whether they had any idea what was happening inside their own shoulders or not. And brown fat wasn't the only physiological trick already running in the background. Your body also relies on a process called peripheral vasoconstriction, where blood vessels near the skin's surface, particularly in the hands, feet, and face, narrow automatically in cold conditions, redirecting warm blood flow toward the body's core to protect vital organs, at the direct expense of your fingers and toes, which is exactly why extremities are almost always the first body parts to feel painfully cold. Alongside this, shivering thermogenesis, the involuntary muscle contractions most people are more familiar with, generates heat as a metabolic byproduct of rapid, repeated muscle activity, another built-in response requiring no conscious decision-making whatsoever. Researchers studying cold acclimatization have found that repeated cold exposure can actually shift a person's physiological response over time, with some studies on individuals regularly exposed to cold water or cold climates showing a gradual shift toward relying more heavily on non-shivering thermogenesis, the quieter brown fat-driven heat production, rather than the more energetically costly shivering response. In other words, your ancestors weren't just passively enduring the cold each winter. Their bodies were likely gradually adjusting their entire heat generation strategy over the course of a single hard season, refining an already remarkable internal toolkit in real time. So if the body already had some cold defense built in, why do specific human populations look and function so differently in extreme cold environments today? This is where things get genuinely interesting from an evolutionary standpoint. Researchers studying cold-adapted populations, including indigenous Arctic groups like the Inuit and Sami peoples of northern Scandinavia, have identified specific genetic variants associated with improved cold tolerance and metabolic regulation. A well-documented example involves a variant in a gene called CPT1A, found at notably higher frequency in Inuit populations, associated with altered fat metabolism that researchers believe may have provided an advantage in processing the extremely high-fat, high-calorie diets necessary for sustained cold survival in Arctic conditions. Beyond genetics, researchers studying body proportions across human populations have long pointed to a pattern known as Bergmann's and Allen's rules. General biological tendencies where populations adapted to colder climates tend to show relatively shorter limbs and a bulkier body shape, reducing surface area relative to body mass, and therefore reducing heat loss compared to populations adapted to hot climates, which tend to show the opposite pattern. Neanderthals, who lived through some of the harshest sustained cold periods in human evolutionary history across Ice Age Europe, show this pattern especially clearly seen in the fossil record, with notably stocky, compact builds that most researchers interpret as a cold climate adaptation refined over hundreds of thousands of years. But wait, genetics and body shape take generations, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years, to shift meaningfully. What about humans who arrived in brutally cold environments without that kind of evolutionary head start? This is where technology and culture had to do the heavy lifting biology alone couldn't provide fast enough. And one specific piece of evidence reveals almost exactly when this technological shift happened. In 2003, researchers led by geneticist Mark Stoneking analyzed the genetic divergence between human head lice and human body lice, two closely related but distinct parasite populations, reasoning that body lice, which live specifically in clothing rather than directly on skin and hair, could only have evolved as a separate population once humans began regularly wearing clothing. Their genetic analysis estimated this divergence occurred roughly 170,000 years ago, give or take, providing one of the more clever indirect pieces of evidence for when clothing itself became a consistent part of human life. Long before woven fabric existed, humans were apparently already wrapping themselves in something substantial enough, and worn consistently enough, to create an entirely new evolutionary niche for a parasite that had never existed before. Here's a pattern interrupt worth sitting with. Somewhere in deep prehistory, a genuinely obscure species of insect accidentally left behind one of our best clues about when humans first got dressed for the cold. Now here's the part nobody talks about. Clothing didn't stop at simple animal hides thrown over the shoulders. It became remarkably sophisticated, remarkably quickly, once the right tools existed to make it that way. Archaeological evidence for eyed sewing needles, made from bone or ivory, fine enough to work with sinew thread, appears at multiple sites dating back roughly 40,000 years, marking a critical technological leap from simply draping a hide over the body to actually tailoring fitted, layered garments that could trap warm air far more effectively. Researchers studying cold climate archaeology, including sites associated with the broader Gravettian culture across Ice Age Europe, have found evidence suggesting these populations were producing genuinely fitted clothing, potentially including multiple layers, hoods, and even footwear, rather than simple loose wraps. Some researchers examining burial evidence, including beadwork patterns found at sites like Sungir in Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, have proposed that the specific placement of thousands of tiny ivory beads found on skeletal remains suggests they were originally sewn onto tailored clothing, tracing the outline of garments that have long since decomposed, leaving only the decorative beadwork behind as a kind of ghost silhouette of clothing technology that would otherwise be completely invisible to us today. There's an especially clever piece of evidence pointing specifically to footwear, rather than clothing in general, and it comes from an unexpected source: toe bones. Researchers analyzing skeletal remains from certain Upper Paleolithic sites have observed a notable reduction in the robustness of the smaller outer toe bones starting at particular points in the archaeological record, a pattern some researchers interpret as evidence that consistent footwear use changes the mechanical stresses placed on the foot during walking, since a foot gripping bare ground for traction develops differently than one supported and cushioned by a shoe or boot. This kind of skeletal evidence offers something written or oral history never could: a direct physical record, preserved for tens of thousands of years in bone itself, of a behavior as seemingly mundane as regularly wearing shoes, quietly reshaping the human body from the ground up, generation after generation, long before anyone thought to write any of it down. But even the warmest clothing in the world doesn't help much if the shelter around you is losing heat just as fast as your body can generate it. So how did ancient humans actually solve the shelter side of this equation? This is where the archaeological record gets genuinely remarkable, particularly at a site in modern-day Ukraine called Mesorik, where archaeologists uncovered the remains of dwellings dated to roughly 15,000 years ago, constructed almost entirely from mammoth bones. Researchers studying the site have documented structures built using dozens of mammoth skulls, tusks, and long bones as a structural framework, likely covered originally with hides and turf for insulation, representing an extraordinary feat of engineering in an environment with essentially no trees available for conventional wooden construction. This wasn't a desperate, improvised shelter. It was a deliberate, structurally sophisticated building strategy, using the largest available local material to solve a problem that simply had no other obvious solution on the open, treeless Ice Age steppe. And shelter design in colder climates frequently relied on a strategy that might seem counterintuitive at first: going underground, or at least partially underground, rather than building purely upward. Archaeological evidence from numerous cold climate sites across Europe and Asia shows widespread use of semi-subterranean dwellings, structures partially dug into the earth with only a portion of the roof and walls extending above ground level. This design takes advantage of a basic thermal property of soil that ancient builders clearly understood through hard-earned practical experience, even without any formal knowledge of insulation physics. Ground temperature below a certain depth remains significantly more stable than surface air temperature, staying warmer than the brutal winter air above, while also staying cooler in summer. By partially burying a shelter, Ancient builders were essentially using the earth itself as a passive thermal buffer, reducing the temperature difference their fires and clothing had to work against, long before anyone had a word for insulation, let alone geothermal design principles. There's also a surprisingly technical layer of expertise buried in which specific animal furs ancient hunters actually chose to use, and how they were worn. Ethnographic studies of traditional Arctic clothing making, including detailed documentation of Inuit garment construction, describe a widely used layering technique involving an inner layer worn with the fur facing inward against the skin for trapped air insulation, and an outer layer worn with the fur facing outward to shed wind and moisture. A two-layer system that modern outdoor gear manufacturers have essentially rediscovered and rebranded, centuries later, as base layers and shell layers. Certain furs were also specifically prized for particular properties well understood through generations of practical use rather than any formal material science, including caribou hide, valued for hollow guard hairs that trap air exceptionally well, providing insulation performance that some modern researchers studying traditional cold weather materials have found genuinely rivals or exceeds many synthetic modern alternatives. None of this was guesswork passed down through trial alone. It represented an accumulated, highly specific body of practical material knowledge, refined across countless winters, about which animal, which layer, and which orientation actually kept a person alive when the temperature dropped low enough to kill. But wait, even brilliant clothing and brilliant shelter designs still leave one obvious gap. None of it matters much if the fire inside actually goes out in the middle of a brutal winter night. How did ancient humans actually manage that risk? This is where social behavior becomes just as important as any individual piece of technology. Ethnographic and archaeological evidence strongly suggests fire maintenance through long winter nights was rarely left to chance or to a single individual. Group sleeping arrangement. Common across countless hunter-gatherer societies, both historically documented and studied in the modern era, served a dual purpose in cold climates specifically. Shared body heat, meaningfully reducing individual heat loss in a group compared to sleeping alone, and distributed responsibility for periodically tending a central fire through the night, connecting directly to earlier research on historically documented segmented sleep patterns, where waking periods during the night weren't a modern sleep disorder, but a practical opportunity to check that the fire hadn't died down to embers while everyone else stayed asleep. A fire going out at 2 in the morning during a genuine Ice Age winter wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a potentially fatal equipment failure, and ancient social sleeping arrangements appear to have functioned, whether consciously designed that way or not, as a remarkably effective redundancy system against exactly that risk. Now here's a factor that's easy to overlook entirely, because it doesn't involve fire, shelter, or clothing at all. It involves what ancient humans were actually eating, and why winter diets in cold climates looked so different from what we might assume. Researchers studying Paleolithic diets in cold climate regions have found strong evidence for extremely high fat consumption, particularly during winter months, including rendered animal fat, bone marrow, and organ meats prioritized specifically for their caloric density. This wasn't simply about having enough food generally. Metabolizing fat and protein for sustained body heat production, especially through non-shivering thermogenesis in that brown fat tissue we discussed earlier, requires substantial caloric input. And researchers studying Arctic and subarctic traditional diets, including modern studies of Inuit dietary patterns, have documented daily caloric intakes during cold seasons significantly higher than typical modern dietary recommendations. Driven almost entirely by the sheer metabolic cost of staying warm in an environment actively trying to strip heat away from the body around the clock. Ancient humans weren't simply eating to avoid starvation. In genuinely cold environments, eating enough fat, consistently enough, was itself a direct physiological form of heating technology, converted internally, 1 calorie at a time, into the exact thermogenic response their brown fat tissue was built to produce. And none of that high-fat winter diet would have been possible without an entire separate body of preservation knowledge developed specifically to make autumn abundance last through months of scarcity. Archaeological evidence for food preservation techniques, including smoking meat over fires, air-drying strips of lean meat into an early form of jerky, and rendering and storing fat in sealed containers, appears across numerous cold-climate prehistoric sites, alongside evidence of deliberately constructed storage pits, some cold enough, when dug into permanently frozen or seasonally frozen ground, to function as a genuinely effective natural freezer. Researchers studying seasonal subsistence strategies among traditional Arctic and subarctic societies have documented remarkably sophisticated caching systems. sometimes involving multiple storage locations positioned specifically to protect food from scavenging animals while remaining accessible under heavy snow cover. This preservation knowledge mattered just as much as the hunting itself. A successful autumn hunt that spoiled within weeks would have done almost nothing to solve a 5-month winter food problem, which means the difference between surviving and not surviving a hard winter often came down not to how much food a group could kill in October, but to how well they understood the completely separate skill set required to keep that food edible until March. So the full picture starts coming into focus, and it's far more integrated than any single factor on its own. But it's worth being honest about something uncomfortable here too. None of this technology guaranteed success, and the archaeological and skeletal record makes that painfully clear in places. Researchers studying seasonal mortality patterns in prehistoric populations, using techniques like dental growth analysis and skeletal stress markers, have found evidence in multiple ancient populations of nutritional stress and increased mortality risks, specifically clustering around late winter and early spring, precisely the period when stored food reserves from the previous autumn's harvest and hunting season would have been running dangerously low, and new food sources hadn't yet become available. Winter survival wasn't some fully solved, guaranteed outcome for ancient humans. It was a genuinely difficult, high-stakes annual challenge that some individuals, and in harsher years, entire groups, didn't survive. Even the extinction of Neanderthals, who show such striking cold climate physical adaptations in the fossil record, remains a topic of active scientific debate, with researchers generally now favoring a combination of factors, including competition with incoming modern humans and genuinely severe climate fluctuations during the period of their disappearance, rather than any single, simple cause. The cold wasn't an enemy ancient humans simply cleanly defeated once and for all. It was a recurring, sometimes fatal test passed successfully far more often than not, but never guaranteed. A brown fat cell quietly burns energy to generate heat, exactly as it was built to do, whether the person carrying it understands the biology or not. A body lightly stocky and short-limbed retains warmth its taller, leaner cousins would lose twice as fast, an adaptation carved slowly across hundreds of thousands of winters. A bone needle pulls sinew thread through hide, closing a seam that will hold body heat in against wind an unsewn wrap could never fully contain. A mammoth skull becomes a structural beam, a wall, a roof, because a Ukrainian steppe with no trees left ancient builders no other option. And they built one anyway. A fire tended through the deep hours of a segmented, watchful night keeps burning specifically because no single person had to bear the full weight of keeping it alive alone. None of that happened by accident, and none of it happened all at once. It was hundreds of thousands of years of trial, failure, adjustment, and occasionally brutal loss, compounding generation after generation into a body of knowledge so thoroughly integrated into human behavior that most of it never needed to be written down at all. It simply got passed on, winter after winter, by the people who made it through to teach the next generation exactly what had worked. Which brings us back to that thermostat argument. 68 degrees, suddenly looking a lot less dramatic than it did a few minutes ago. You're not actually cold. You're mildly inconvenienced by a machine doing, effortlessly and instantly, what it once took your ancestors an entire integrated system of biology, clothing, architecture, diet, and social cooperation to achieve night after night for hundreds of thousands of winters in a row, with absolutely no guarantee any individual night would end well. You didn't inherit a fear of the cold. You inherited every single system your ancestors built specifically to make sure that fear never had to become the ending.